Welcome to the Bible and the Trinity in Conflict, Part 12. John 1:1 is the text we're going to talk about. It's the only text, really. We will bring up other texts as they may relate on some level, but the focus. Whereas in prior shows in this series, we've considered several texts typically in each video. This video, we're just going to look at one because it's enough. It contains everything we really need to focus on in order to fully understand what it's talking about. And then we'll move forward into the prologue of John, all the way through to the end. But to start with, we're going to give our attention to the first verse. Now, as I noted in the description, I've already done a video recently about John 1:1. Made easy. No Greek. Not really. Just a couple words, right, that everyone should be able to speak. Because if you're going to analyze a text that was originally written in Greek, a couple words is not too much to ask if you're going to analyze it and ask questions about what it means. So words like logos, which are also a part of many other languages' vocabularies, reference to software or to other products, right? So many people are familiar with this term, theos. So I used those terms primarily in my John 1:1 Made Easy video. Now in this video, it's not going to be so complicated that you can't understand it. Somewhat easy, I would say, or easily. But we are going to take a deeper dive into the grammatical issues. Things that most people aren't as familiar with or comfortable discussing because, well, anything you're not familiar with and that involves terms or references that are just, you don't fully understand because you don't use them often, can be a little intimidating, right? So the goal of this video, even though we will get into a deeper discussion of this text, it's not to lose people. It's not to enter the discussion at such a high level that you're not going to be able to understand and use what we're talking about. In fact, I would say, if you cannot understand what I'm talking about, and it's not you who's failing to understand, right? You're really trying, is what I'm saying. Then I look at it as I haven't done my job. My job, if I understand these issues in texts, is to make them explainable. Just like it should be for anybody. It doesn't matter if you're a professor, a doctor, a lawyer. If you're so educated in what you know, and usually people in those positions and others are educated because they've attained those degrees either on their own or through the universities. So we expect they know. We expect people who've studied issues know, whether they have degrees or not, right? If they've been involved and they've studied and they claim to know, okay, show. Right? If you can't show you understand and can break it down so people can understand, that's not the sign of true education. You might understand it, but if you can't break it down so other people understand what you're saying and they always need you to explain it, that can be a problem. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try not to. And I don't believe we need to. There are some things you need to study in order to understand, right? While we grow and learn our own native language and maybe others through the process of education, there are things we just don't become familiar with, like Greek grammar, right? Hebrew grammar. So unless you take the time to study, either on your own or at a university or otherwise, with a tutor or something, reading through a book. However, if you don't take the time, it's not going to make much sense to you. So those of us who've taken time, we should be able to understand what we're talking about in order to make it sensible to you. That's what I intend to do. So I'm going to be discussing certain issues. But I believe, just like with the John 1:1 Made Easy video, I can do so in a way that will give everyone a clear view of why I and others believe the Bible and the Trinity are in conflict. As I've said previously, if the Bible taught the Trinity, I wouldn't have any problem with it, because I accept the Bible as an accurate record of history and Judeo-Christian teaching that I've accepted. So if it taught that in the ways that Trinitarians teach it, then that's what I would accept. But the problem is, for people like me and others, we don't see the Trinity in the biblical text. And what we do see tells us that the Trinity is not taught in the text. But the Trinity came next, later on, through various controversies that we'll talk about later on in this series. Because of these texts, because of people who were using them and other people who were trying to understand them, and then ultimately the Trinity, again through much controversy, was accepted as the understanding of these texts. The understanding necessary for Christians to express in order to be considered orthodox or correct. So, those of us who don't accept the Trinitarian explanation as from the text or consistent with the text, we get in conflict with people who do. And while we try to discuss each other's views, it really keeps us from sharing the message of the New Testament. And so it becomes a problem for us more often than it's helpful. Nevertheless, many people accept the Trinity and use it to worship the God of the Bible. So we accept, when I say we, I mean people like me, Christian witnesses of Jah, even though we believe three things, namely God the Father is the one God, Jesus is the Messiah he sent forth, and the Golden Rule, we nonetheless accept that people have been taught the Trinity and understand it and accept it at times because they believe it's a way they can make sense of references to beings like Jesus as God, or, depending on God, capital or lowercase g, we'll talk about it. But either way, my point is, it's easier for some people, namely Trinitarians, to use the Trinity to make sense of texts that apply the term for God to people like Jesus, the Father, and the Holy Spirit. So they use the Trinity to avoid what they consider polytheism in the sense that is rejected by the Bible. And that's why they use it. So I don't see Trinitarians or the Trinity as this necessarily evil antithesis to the biblical text. I do believe there are people who knowingly misrepresent the biblical text and use the Trinity to do so, or create controversy so much so that they're clearly more interested in the debate than they are promoting three things, or even one thing together, right? Because they want to argue when we're together. So there's differences, and I try to be accommodating for those things and treat others the way I want to be treated, even when it comes to theological differences like the Trinity. But it comes up so often that even if, I try to adopt the most accommodating position in terms of working with other people who confess the Christ as Christians, use the Trinity, it's not easy to have them use it to worship God and not promote it while they're with you as the way to be, right? That's what the text teaches, right? So let's say you're with a Trinitarian and you're a non-Trinitarian and you start reading John 1:1. Maybe it comes up while you're with someone else. Maybe you're doing charity work together and you've kind of put aside your differences and you realize, you know what? Let's go help these people. Okay, let's go. And then the person wants you to read the Bible to them. And let's just say for this example, you ask them which text they want you to read, and they say, just start reading in John. And you start reading John 1:1, right? And they have the King James Bible. Now you have a Trinitarian and non-Trinitarian who came in this scenario to work together as Christians, and now the text comes up, right? The text will always come up at some point because the text a Trinitarian and a non-Trinitarian read or use are going to be different in places. Most notably, probably, John 1:1. So, in the King James Bible, and as we showed in my John 1:1 Made Easy video, link in the description, pretty much every Bible except a few, right? And I know there are others out there too, but I'm talking the most well-known texts King James, New International, New Revised Standard, right? New American Standard Bible. They're all going to say, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, capital G-O-D. And the Word was God, capital G-O-D. And then you have, for example, in the New World Translation, I'll see if I can pull it up here for us briefly. The familiar translation that we know, I'll go ahead and bring that up for you, where it says here, in the beginning the Word was, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. That's a big difference, right? Than God, capital G-O-D, like we read in all of those translations in John 1:1 made easy. Or that you could pull up in most any Bible right now and see. A God is a big difference from God. So what does each one mean? Right? Is this one a polytheistic translation in the sense that the Bible rejects when it says there's no other gods but God, or Jah? Or is this consistent with sons of God theology, the way Jesus argues in John 10, quoting Psalm 82, to show that the sons of God are gods? They're just not the same gods that are rejected by God when he says there are no other gods but God. He's talking about the idol gods of the nations, the gods that he opposes and that oppose him. Not the ones that represent him. Not the ones whom he sends as him. So that effectively there is no other God. We've talked about it. We'll talk about it more in just a moment. But we're going to focus on a few other things first. What I'm presenting there, though, is that this could be looked at either way. Right? As a polytheistic translation, teaching that there's more than one God in the sense that God rejects when he says there are no other gods but God. Or the sense in which Jesus says those against whom God came are gods as the sons of God, and so therefore he as a son of God is also a God, John 10. We'll get to later in this prologue in John 1:18, where the most likely reading, I believe, shows that Jesus again is called God in a sense not applicable to the Father. So we'll talk more about the understanding of Father, because that's important as well. But just know that by Father at this point I mean God. We'll talk about what is meant by Trinitarians and what the Bible says more in a moment. All right, so we have God and a God. Here's my translation from my work in progress, The Great Message. And I hope to have the book of Proverbs translation of both the Greek and Hebrew done by the end of this year. So within a couple months, it's going to be tough. Probably will take me a little longer. And then I'm hoping to have it edited and ready to release by summer 2021. But I've done other texts, including John 1:1. So here's how I translate it. The Word was in the beginning, and the Word was there with God. And the Word was a divine being, or a God. And I have a note below it. I'll probably expand on it by the time I come around to publishing this translation, but it's a work in progress. And at this point, it reflects what I believe in terms of the translation of this text in a brief form. By referring to the person of the Word as a divine being, a God, John here makes use of the well-known concept of God's divine sons, like I was just talking about, from other Jewish, biblical, and related literature. And then I give a variety of texts, including Psalm 82:1, John 10. These beings, and especially the Word Jesus, do not rival Jah, nor do they ever promote their own worship apart from the Father. Hence, in spite of their being gods, they do not in any way compromise their Judeo-Christian belief in one God, the Father. So that's not, in my case, meant in any way to contradict what the Bible teaches about there being no other gods but Jah when he's coming against the gods of the nations, the idols of the nations, not his own sons who are gods who represent him, or who are gods on their own over the nations like in Psalm 82 and that Jesus refers to, and that God comes against in judgment, but that they're still gods. And so how even more so the case for Jesus or the other sons of God who don't abuse their position over the nations as gods. So we still nonetheless have these texts and their difference in translation. So we have God, capital G-O-D, a God, lowercase G-O-D, and then my translation, a divine being. Why the differences? Is there a way we can come to a more clear understanding of this text? Well, in my John 1:1 Made Easy video, I do believe I provided a way in which you can do just that, with minimal involvement of anything technical, really. But let's look past for a moment John 1:1b, right? Because John 1:1b was the key. It is the key. And that's what I explained in my John 1:1 Made Easy video. I'll get to it further in a moment. But let's set that key aside. And can we unlock it? Can we unlock the door to John 1:1 using John 1:1c? What does it mean? Apart from, we're not going to set it apart entirely, right? We have to use the text, the context, so I'm not doing that. I'm just saying, let's just for a moment take a look at the last part. The part that's different, right? For the most part, there's a little bit of wording difference earlier, but really it's this last part, the way the word is described. It's the same word in the Greek, theos. Now, it's different from what you see in John 1:1b, like we talked about before, because it doesn't have the article. And as we talked about before, no one claims that I know, and certainly not me, that theos without the article in this case being the in Greek. Nobody argues that theos without the article can't be translated God, capital G-O-D, or a God. But often you'll see on different YouTube videos and certain writings, people who will highlight the use of God later, even in John 1, the prologue, in the first chapter of John and elsewhere, where in texts like the NWT, whereas in John 1:1c, theos without the article is translated a God. Elsewhere, it's translated God without the article. And so Trinitarians will say, well, see, you translate theos without the article there as God. Why not in John 1:1c? Why not indeed? Well, we've already talked about it in relation to John 1:1b, have we not? And we already know, as is easy to show, that you can translate theos without the article as God or a God. Whereas with the article, you really can't do that. It's not as likely or even possible. So we have more options with John 1:1c, whereas in John 1:1b, we don't. And yet you're going to see. It doesn't really matter. Well, it matters to me, and hopefully to you. I'm not so sure it matters to those who believe in the Trinity. Well, it does in one sense, and in another it doesn't. So let's get to it. All right. To help us kind of further discuss why we have such an issue in John 1:1c, but not elsewhere in John or elsewhere where the theos without the article is used. Why is it in John 1:1c we have a problem like that? What problem in the difference of translation? Okay, let's go to a text of mine. This is the third edition. I have my second and third edition here. I'll have my first edition in electronic form as soon as I can, so that all three can be available that way. They each have differences, more or less material, but there's also a lot of overlap. But if possible, I encourage you to get all three once they're available. For now, I'll use my third edition. I'm on page 316. A chapter about Jesus as God, quote, and as a God. Pretty much what we're talking about right now. So here at the bottom of page 316, I'll start here. Let's read a little bit of this together, and then I'll comment, and we'll discuss it. But I want to highlight a few things here that maybe you haven't seen the way we're going to talk about, or maybe there's just because there's a lot of material in my different JWD editions, you just haven't isolated the key parts that I think help the most when it comes to this discussion about John 1:1 and the grammar of 1:1c specifically. So let's take a look. The Logos has God, a God, and divine. Right? That's another word. Right? We saw that kind of partially in mine, a divine being. But I didn't just use divine, right? Which translations like Goodspeed and Moffat use. A little bit older, but within the last 100 years, right? And so they translate the word was divine. So what's going on here? All right, so then I say we come down to the translation understanding of the key term. When answering the question of how this word, right, we're talking about theos right here. When answering the question of how this word should be translated when it is predicated of the word, predicated when it's used to describe the word, right? The word was theos. He's being described as theos, either as God, a divine being, or divine. Pretty much, right? There's a couple variations some translations offer, but that's the main range of likely translations. So when we see predicate, predicated, we're talking about descriptions. When it's predicated of the word in theos in halagos, John 1:1c. It was for a long time rather common for supporters of the translation the word was God, capital G-O-D, to cite an article written in 1933 by Trinitarian scholar E.C. Caldwell. Trinitarian writer Dr. Walter Martin, for example, wrote, with my underlining, Caldwell's rule clearly states that a definite predicate nominative, right? So a descriptive noun, in the Greek what they call nominative case. And he says definite here, right? Caldwell's rule clearly states that a definite predicate nominative never takes an article, like the, when it precedes the verb was, as in John 1:1. Okay, so this is Martin here, writing back in the 70s, Kingdom of the Cults, influenced a ton of people, right? A lot of copies sold. He says, referring to the 1933 article by Caldwell, a Trinitarian scholar, that Caldwell's rule clearly states, a definite predicate nominative, theos, never takes an article when it precedes the verb, as in John 1:1. Okay, then I go on. But the rule, quote, to which Martin refers is actually stated by Caldwell like this, quote, definite predicate nouns which precede the verb usually. Right? Usually versus Martin's never. Now, presumably, Martin read Caldwell's article, right? I mean, he's quoting it. And he's not quoting it right. He quotes it as saying never. Caldwell actually said usually. I said Martin's misquotation and misrepresentation of what Caldwell wrote continues to this day in reprinted editions of Martin's The Kingdom of the Cults. They're reprinting this lie nonstop. I mean, it's just, they can't apparently make a simple correction from never to usually. Or if they have, then, it's taken them a long time. How Martin got that wrong, everyone makes mistakes. I understand that. But his has been happening a long time, well after his death. The reason Caldwell's work has so often been cited in defense of the translation "the Word was God" is because of what Caldwell stated on page 21 of his article. Listen close. This is what Caldwell wrote in his article regarding definite predicate nouns, like what some claim is theos in John 1:1c. It's a predicate noun, right? It's a noun, theos, and it's describing the Word. The Word was something, theos. It's a predicate noun. But is it definite? And what does that mean? So definite would have to mean a specific individual, right? A definite, identifiable theos. That's what that means. Whereas an indefinite, right, is one of others. And it's not the only one necessarily, depending on the context, but indefinite of the use of a implies that there is more than one, at least of some kind. Whereas in the context in which you would use a definite reference for theos or anything, you have a specific one in mind. Just like in John 1:1b. What does John have in mind? He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Well, what does Genesis 1:1 say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? It doesn't talk about the Word. It talks about him speaking and saying, let us create. So the Word, we believe, was there. And of course, in Job 38:7, all the sons of God were there, including Jesus, the Son of God. But the God who's mentioned there is known, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on to talk about everything related to that God. So when John uses the God in John 1:1b, he's talking about a specific God who was in the beginning, right? It's the God. It uses the article. It has to be definite there because he's identifying that God, that the Word is with. That God that he was with in the beginning is the God the Word is with. So the Word is identified as the known God from Genesis 1. He's identified as with that God. Then the Word has theos predicated of it without the identifying article, the definitive mark, the mark of what is definite, right? The article. So why does Martin, and why do Caldwell, as we'll see in a moment, keep referring to theos in John 1:1c as definite when it doesn't have the article? And when the article, or when a noun is definite with or without the article, right, it has to refer to a specific God. Yet that's not what they believe, as we're going to see further in a moment. So keep that in mind. They keep referring, at least Martin at this point, referring to Caldwell, that theos in John 1:1c is definite. Yet, as you're going to see, they don't really understand it as definite in the way that definite means, an identifiable one. Let's keep going. The reason Caldwell's work, okay, and then I read that part, because he says, loosely speaking, this study may be said to have increased. This study, 1933 article by Caldwell that Martin's referring to and that I'm quoting right now, Caldwell says his own study may be said to have increased the definiteness of a predicate noun before the verb without the article, and to have decreased the definiteness of a predicate noun after the verb without the article. So he's saying that his study actually makes it more likely that a noun before the verb, a predicate noun, is definite. Increase the definiteness of a predicate noun before the verb, and to have decreased the definiteness of a predicate noun after the verb without the article. We're going to see why that's such a problem in a moment. But I'm emphasizing it right now so that when I show why it's a problem, you'll know what I'm referring to. Because Trinitarians have long favored the translation, the word was God, which was also viewed as a definite translation of theos. Right? That's even what Martin's doing. Right? Clearly states that a definite predicate nominative, God. This is Martin. This is in quotes. Here's the reference. Right? There's a lot more stuff, but you can read this on your own. I encourage you to do so. Let's stick with this. It's very clear, right? He's using Caldwell's rule to reinforce his belief that theos in John 1:1c doesn't need an article to be definite. And they're basically saying, yeah, it's definite in John 1:1b, but it's also definite in John 1:1c, no matter whether it has the article. That's what he's saying. That's what he's arguing for right here. Okay. And that's why right here, Caldwell's study was, and to some extent still is, welcomed uncritically by Trinitarians, like Martin. But some Trinitarians, including Robert M. Bowman Jr., have recognized a logical blunder in Caldwell's conclusion. In spite of this, Bowman still believes Caldwell is not necessarily saying that an anarthrous, without the article, predicate noun is most likely, as a matter of statistical measure, to be definite if it precedes the verb. And yet, that is precisely what Caldwell is saying. I would say Bowman is gaslighting everybody right here, right? He's saying that what Caldwell is saying is what he's not saying. It's gaslighting. And he also, uses anarthrous here in referring to Caldwell, when Caldwell is referring to definite predicate nouns, right? Just like with Martin. He's already assuming definiteness. And then using his own study to increase the likelihood of definiteness that he's already assumed, right? Definite predicate nouns. It's the title of his article. I believe. Let's take a look. Where is that article? A definite rule for the use of the article in the Greek Testament, right? It's not definite predicate nouns. But the article that he uses, or the rule, which we're going to read in a moment, specifically refers to definite nouns. So keep that in mind again. We'll get to the rule specifically as it's worded in a moment. Though one could speculate about just what Caldwell meant by loosely speaking, Bowman's statement clearly does not represent what Caldwell had in mind. In fact, right after Caldwell says his rule may, loosely speaking, have increased the definiteness of an anarthrous predicate noun preceding the verb, and to have decreased the definiteness, Caldwell reveals that he did, in fact, contrary to Bowman's claim, believe that an anarthrous predicate noun is most likely definite if it precedes the verb. Consider Caldwell's own words. The opening verse of John's Gospel contains one of many passages where this rule suggests the translation of a predicate as a definite noun. He's doing exactly what Bowman says he's not doing. He says, kai theos ein halagos, John 1:1c, looks much more like, and the word was God, capital G-O-D, than, and the word was divine, when viewed with reference to this rule. Looks much more like when viewed with reference to this rule. So when Bowman says that Caldwell is not saying that an anarthrous noun is most likely as a matter of statistical measure to be definite if it precedes the verb, that is exactly what he's saying. And he says it pretty much twice, right? This rule suggests that theos in John 1c should be translated as a definite noun. It looks much more like a definite noun than a qualitative translation when viewed with reference to this rule. So the rule is what's making it look much more like God. How would it do that if not by a statistical measure that is the examples that Caldwell's using? So Bowman's just denying reality, and which is what they do often. They have to, right? And if you don't understand what's happening and how, it will not be easy for you. And so that's why I'm going over it in addition to having written about it, because you need to look closely at it and see what I'm really trying to show you. Now notice also that Caldwell makes an explicit contrast between the definite translation God and the Word was divine. So that shows he does not understand, at least, this is where it gets really, what's the word? I'll use confusing. He's making an explicit contrast, is he not, between the translation of God, capital G-O-D, as a definite noun. It says it right here. Than, right? He's making a comparison. It looks much more like this than this because of this. So he's saying this isn't what we're really looking at when you apply this rule to John 1:1. This is what we're looking at. Now I'm going to argue that I think Caldwell, even though he's arguing for a definite translation here, even in direct contrast to, we'll say, a qualitative translation, right? Divine. I'm going to argue he still understands that definite translation as divine, pretty much. Because, as we're going to discuss, Trinitarians cannot identify the Word in John 1:1c as the God he's with. They can't identify him as God at all. Ever. It's a myth. They'll say he's God. I know that. They don't mean it, though. What they mean is that he has the nature of God, that he's divine. But they're so lost in their translation and understanding and how they fit together. They're getting better now, right? They're kind of trying to bring the two together in a way that, although the majority of texts still say Word was God, capital G-O-D, that doesn't matter, right? You have Martin, you have Caldwell, both arguing for God as definite. But that's not really how they understand it. They're Trinitarian. They understand it to mean that he's a person of God. He has the divine nature of God. We'll get further into it more in a moment, but I'm just pointing out. Right? And so this is where we get into a lot of controversy with the Watchtower, because the Watchtower has quoted other writers against Caldwell as, you know, and made Trinitarians like Bowman object and say, hey, you can't cite Harner because Harner doesn't agree with you when it comes to this qualitative stuff. Right? Harner's a Trinitarian. We'll get to it in a moment. But the society, as far as I can see, and as I show in my writings against Bowman, they're using Harner and the qualitative writings, his primarily, and others, to argue against the definite view of people like Caldwell and Martin. Right? Whether or not the society, it's hard for me to tell at times whether they clearly understood the Trinitarian mind and thinking in terms of their use of the divine and qualitative words or understanding nature of God, right? Sometimes it seems like the society doesn't understand that, well, it's different from God, definitely. And so their use of it is correct, I believe. They're often using it against capital G-O-D as a definite translation. Not necessarily to adopt the Trinitarian understanding of the non-definite translation like divine. So Bowman attacks him because he says, well, you can't do that because you don't mean the same thing. But they're really using what the Trinitarian like Harner means against the Trinitarian like Caldwell and what he's arguing for in terms of a definite reference to God, which Bowman and Harner would also agree for the most part, at least in the way that it would identify Jesus as the God he's with, right? They can't have that. So let's go on. Just keep that in mind, though, that in the case of Caldwell and Martin and others, they were using Caldwell's rule to argue that it was more likely that theos in John 1:1c was definite, against divine, against qualitative, even though I think that's how they ultimately understood it. And I'll show that for another moment. But this is the confusion that's been involved with the Trinitarians and how they've had a hard time really getting their understanding lined up with their translation and not having these contradictory arguments or seemingly contradictory arguments, right? In terms of the understanding, I think they're consistent, right? Because they all believe in the Trinity. But when they argue for it grammatically, they're definitely in conflict with each other because they're not coming to the same conclusion. They are theologically, but not grammatically. Okay, so Bowman, I believe, misunderstands and misrepresents what Caldwell clearly believed about his own rule and what people like even Martin believed and used in regards to his rule, that it argued for a definite translation. The word was God, capital G-O-D. But that's a problem, right? It is, because many non-Trinitarians have pointed it out. That means he can't be with God if he is God. And then that's when Trinitarians say what? Well, he's with the Father. And he's not the Father, right? The Trinity teaches one God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So they then do the word substitution. It says God, right? Word was with God. Ha theos. Or in the equivalent with the article in the grammatical case used in 1.1b. So, he's with that God. It doesn't use Father. It doesn't associate it with a Trinitarian understanding of Father or God, which is nowhere in the New Testament. So when you just use the words of the text, you don't really have a problem at that point. You just see him as with God, and so therefore he'd have to be a God, because he can't be the God he's with, just like the Trinitarians believe. The only difference is they're substituting their word, or the person of the Trinity they identify as the God the word's with, they're substituting that God with that person. When the text says the God, not the person. And so their conflict is, we can't have the word as a divine person be identified with the divine person of the Father, right? They can't be the same person in the Trinity, and they can't have the word be the Trinity, right? If they say he was with the Trinity in some kind of associative way. Either way, they can't have that. Right, so but when a person who's not a Trinitarian reads John 1:1 and sees I'm going to just refer to it in the nominative case, ha theos used for the Father. I say Father because there's one God the Father. I'm not using it in a Trinitarian sense. I'm using it in a biblical sense. So it's not a question of which God he's with, but it says he's with the God. And then theos without the article is used in a non-identifying way, but as a predicate to describe him as a God. He can't be the God he's with. So he has to be a God, even if we translate divine for theos, which we don't have to, nor should we, as I'll get to further in a moment. He'd still have to be a God because he's with the God, and he can't be that God. And unless you allow a Trinitarian to read into the text their understanding that came a long time next, you don't have to argue at all. It says very clearly and obviously right there for all. He's with the God that we all know and can identify with the article in Genesis. He's with that God. And he's described as a God. And if you're a God, yes, you are divine. And if you're divine, you are a God. But Trinitarians don't believe that. So then the text can't mean that, right? Because Trinitarians don't believe they're in disagreement with the text. So what they do is as I said, they change out the God the word's with for the person of the Father. Trinity is assumed right from the outset. It's not the God from Genesis 1:1 he's identifying, unless, you believe that's the Trinity. It has to be the Trinity for them. Or a person of the Trinity in John 1:1b. Because otherwise it won't make sense. Right? They don't understand God as anything but the Trinity or the divine nature that is shared by the three persons of the Trinity. That's it. So they're reading into the text everywhere. John 1:1b, John 1:1c, everywhere. Titus 2:13, Sharp's rule, all of it. That's why I don't get into that very much anymore, even though I will finish that off at some point. But it doesn't make any difference. They don't believe Titus 2:13 identifies Jesus as an individual God, the great God. They don't believe that. They'll say that. Their translations will say that, just like John 1:1 says, capital G-O-D, God. But they don't really mean that, right? They mean divine nature, person of God. Just like in Titus 2:13, they don't mean he's the great God. They'll argue with you over Sharp's rule. We'll get back to Caldwell's rule and Hart in a moment. But just to point out, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. They'll say it matters. And we're going to talk about the things they've said in relation to what they claim matters. It doesn't matter. In Titus 2:13, for example, that's why I don't even really get into Sharp's rule much anymore. It doesn't matter. Right? Why argue over whether or not Jesus is called God there when you and I already believe it? How is that inconsistent with Isaiah 9:5 and 6? Mighty God, the great God. Now, I don't necessarily believe he's called that in Titus 2:13, and I've argued grammatically and otherwise why. But it doesn't matter, because the Trinitarians don't believe that anyway. Just like they don't believe Jesus is God, capital G-O-D, or a God. They believe he's divine. They believe he's a part of the Trinity. And he's only going to be called God, capital G-O-D, or the great God, Titus 2:13, if by that you mean a person with the nature of God. They never, ever, ever, not one single time, mean that Jesus is an individual, identifiable God, separate from the Father. The exact thing John 1:1 tells us. And Titus 2:13 for that matter. Whether the great God is the Father or Jesus. They're still not the same. It's just when the Trinitarians see that, the difference they maintain is when they assume and have to bring to the text. We don't have to, right? We don't need the Trinitarian metaphysic to explain these texts. We have sons of God theology, Jesus use of Psalm 82 and John 10. John 1:18, John 1:1, right? He's with the identifiable God and described as a God. Like the other sons of God are gods, plural, Psalm 82, John 10. So we already know and are taught by both God and Jesus, the sons of God are gods, plural, done. Jesus is one of those gods. He was one of those gods who, like Job 38:7 says, we're shouting applause when God made things in Genesis 1. He was with that God, with those sons of God, as the Son of God in the beginning. No contradiction, no problem, nothing. Enter the Trinity, right? Because that's not going to fly. The Trinitarians don't believe that. Why? Their tradition. Their tradition doesn't allow them to fulfill the Christian mission of teaching these texts the way they're presented to us. Instead, they read back into them these differences, and then they confuse us. All right, now let's get back to the grammar, but it's very important you understand that. I made that point clear also in my John 1:1 Made Easy video. But and even this doesn't really matter, right? It matters and it doesn't because, again, they're going to see God applied to any of the persons of the Trinity in pretty much the same way in terms of a divine nature, a person with that nature. They're never the whole Trinity, any of the persons, and they're never identified as the same person, and they're never identified as a separate individual God. right? The three things, well, in terms of how the Bible teaches the use of God, right? It's either an identifiable God or one of many gods in one sense or another, right? Either as false gods of the nations, idol gods that God rejects, or as the sons of God whom they accept and even call gods. So that's our context. But with Trinitarians, see, that's not in that context. They don't have the Bible to go to tell them, well, this is the person of the Father, three, part of a Trinity. That's later. And then now they look at the text in light of that. So they'll argue with you about this definite translation. We just saw it, right? Martin, Caldwell, and Bowman tried to cover for Caldwell. But it's not true, right? So they're in conflict, right? Even Caldwell's in conflict with his own point of view. Right? He thought his rule increased the chances of a translation that contradicts his understanding, which he contrasts with this understanding, which is the preferred understanding today, that is really what he means, right? Whether Caldwell realizes it or not, that's what he means. He means this by this. And that's what Bowman's, when he's coming to their defense, these Trinitarian writers, even though they're in conflict with each other in the grammatical sense, when they're trying to argue for how they see theos, right? Bowman knows underneath it all, they're Trinitarian, right? So he knows, like when he's writing against society and these other things, and he knows he's got that link to the Trinitarians. But what he doesn't do well is recognize how the society is at times going against the definite view that Bowman's Trinitarian associates and scholars have promoted. Right? So there's more problems here that Bowman, I think, is willing to acknowledge when it comes to how Caldwell's rule and theos as a definite noun have been handled and promoted in light of this attempt to try to make it seem like the grammar of John 1:1 makes it qualitative, right? Where he's not God, i.e. the Trinity, or the person he's with, the Father, or a God, which they can't handle because they think it's polytheism in a bad way all the time. They don't understand sons of God theology, John 10. Right? So they can't have those understandings. So it has to be the nature. He's got the nature of God. That he's divine. Right? See, that works for them because that's actually perfect for a Trinitarian. Because then they don't have to deal with theos as a noun, right? As a definite noun, as identifying the word as a specific God, let alone the God he's with, right? But either way, even if it wasn't in John 1:1, he's with the God. If it's another text like Titus 2:13, right? If it's definite there, and it's got the article there, right? The great God. Well, so what's the difference, right? He's not then said to be with another God. That's true. But how many gods are there, Trinitarians? There's only one. And of course, that's the Father. 1 Corinthians 8:6, the other sons of God reflect and represent him. But in terms of you believe there's one, too, right? The Trinity. And that each of the persons are fully that God. But Jesus is called definitely God in Titus 2:13, according to you. So that's not qualitative, right? He's not being called, I don't even know how you Trinitarians would try to break down Titus. You just have to basically say the same thing, right? The Titus 2:13 is saying he's fully God. He's got the nature of God. You can't have him be the God, period. Not without then unwinding it to say what I'm saying right now, and that is you mean divine, right? You mean the nature of God. You mean that in John 1:1b. You mean that in John 1:1c. You mean that in Titus 2:13. So it's, the game is over in that sense. We're no longer going to allow this nonstop misuse of the text just so you can read into each use of theos your preferred understanding and try to hide it behind this grammatical argument, whether John 1:1 or Sharp's rule type. It doesn't make a difference. You can't have him identified as God, period. And you can't have him as a God, period. You could only have him as a person of God, with the nature of God. Period. So, we're spending all this time, and we'll spend a little more time, and there's some issues that need to be resolved. But ultimately, Trinitarians, you've got a problem. Your theology is involved. Your theology is being read into these texts, and you have had a long time to get this right, and you haven't gotten it right. Instead, look at how much you've gotten wrong, right? You guys can't really fully come to an agreement after all this time on whether or not it's definite and what that means. Well, you know what it means or what it would mean, and so that's why you don't use it, right? But you do use it, right? In one case, or by some people you do, and you have, and then now you don't, right? Or it can only mean that in the sense in which he's a person of God, just like John 1:1b, right? It doesn't matter, so it's definite. So it's still person of the Trinity. Ultimately, that's what you mean. Because you're assuming the Trinity. You're not reading the text. We read the text, and that's why it comes out as a God. One of the sons of God, who are gods. And the word as a God, one of those sons of God, is with the God that is being identified here. Let's go on a little further and conclude this section on the grammar, though. But I wanted to make that clear. I came back up there. We read down through here. And then, I'll skip past a little bit of this here. I talk a little bit more about different people involved, Dan Wallace and others, Harry Sturz, in relation to what Caldwell stated. But you can read that on your own. We've covered enough already as far as what Caldwell thought about his own rule, what Bowman tried to say about it, what Martin and many people since him have thought about it, and how they've misused it, but how they ultimately all understand it the same way. And so to them, they see the consistency underlying even their own failure to be consistent with the text or how it's explained grammatically. So let's take a look, though, about how another has described the problems with Caldwell's rule. This is by Paul Dixon. Let me get up to it here. And here he says from his master's thesis, The Significance of the Anarthrous Predicate Nominative in John, Dallas Theological Seminary, 1975. He says the only other conceivable value of Caldwell's rule, that is, other than for textual criticism. So it might be useful to determine in which case, which texts likely had the article versus those that didn't when there's a textual variant. That's what he's saying. The only other conceivable value, since Caldwell assumes that the noun is definite from the start, right? He's not using his article, as I explained elsewhere, and as Dixon's talking about. He doesn't use his rule to determine definiteness. He's already done that. He's already determined the definiteness of the nouns that he's talking about. And so Dixon goes on to explain. The only other conceivable value is to say it's possible to have an anarthrous predicate nominative preceding the verb that is definite. But did we not already know this? And that because Caldwell apparently found some. So there's definite nouns that identify specific things or individuals as predicate nominatives preceding the verb. There's examples of that. That doesn't make John 1:1 an example of that. But Caldwell assumed it was already and then used his rule to try to show it was more likely how he saw it. And so Dixon goes on to say, it is most important to see that the rule says nothing about the probability of definiteness, contrary to what Caldwell and Blum would have us believe. Nor can it, as Caldwell has not considered both definite and non-definite nouns. Right? He assumed theos in John 1c is definite. He didn't go into it and say, let's see what it is. He already assumed it, just like I'm telling you, they assume Trinitarianism. They're not going to the text to see what it teaches. They're assuming their belief and then going to the text and telling you and me what it teaches. You see? There's a major difference. Because Caldwell considered only definite predicate nominatives, then his rule applies only when definiteness has already been determined. Then the probability of articularity, that is, whether or not the article is used, may be ascertained. Assuming the rule is valid, its value is almost exclusively for textual criticism. The rule may not be valid, however, as its underlying assumptions are highly questionable. And then I go on to write, ironically, what happens here with regard to Caldwell's rules, as described by Dixon, is also essentially what happens with each Trinitarian assumption. A determination belief is made or accepted first, and then a rule or principle, whether it's Caldwell's rule or a principle of usage for terms such as God or person, is created in order to prove or support what has already been accepted as true. Though Bowman cites Dixon's thesis in his book and agrees that Caldwell's rule cannot determine the correct translation of John 1:1, Bowman agrees with that, Bowman still argues that it is not legitimate to dismiss Caldwell's rule as some otherwise knowledgeable JWs have done. And yet we just read Dixon's near complete dismissal of Caldwell's rule, certainly for any value when it comes to interpreting whether or not theos in John 1:1 is definite or indefinite. And so I go on to write, the only apparent value in Caldwell's article is to show in Arthur's predicate nominatives which precede the verb and which are already considered definite at times lack the article. Caldwell's article does nothing to determine definiteness, as Dixon correctly observed. But then in 1973, Philip Harner wrote an article and brought this into a discussion where the qualities of the noun are highlighted based on its position relative to the verb, specifically predicate nominatives. A Greek noun in the nominative case that's used as a predicate to describe a subject. So I go on to write in his article, Harner suggests, unlike Caldwell, that unarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb, such as theos in John 1:1c, may function primarily, listen to this, may function primarily, not exclusively, but primarily to express what? The nature or character of the subject. This is a big deal here. This is stealth, in my opinion. And this is their attempt to really try to salvage John 1:1. Knowing all the controversy and problems from Caldwell and Caldwell's rule and assuming definiteness. Knowing that's a problem in itself, right? That they can't have the word identified as the God he's with, or as God in any definite sense, right? It has to be. Just like this. Harner says, unlike Caldwell, that unarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb may function to express the nature or character of the subject. Right? Well, wouldn't a predicate noun already do that? Isn't that the whole idea of a predicate noun? It's describing a subject. That's what a predicate noun does. No matter where it's used in the sentence. It's going to describe the subject and attribute to that subject a certain nature or character based on the noun that's used. But they're avoiding those kinds of descriptions, aren't they? It's just purely to this nature or character. And so where are they going with that? Well, Caldwell and other Trinitarians since him have tried to show that grammatically theos in John 1:1c is a definite noun, God. As noted above, Harner and other Trinitarians have put forth another way to understand theos, right? That it involves the placement of a noun like theos that is without the Greek article and that is in a certain word order, where the noun is before the verb. So where we translate John 1:1c, and the word was God or a God, right? The subject is first, the word, then the verb was, and then the predicate description, God or a God. In Greek, the word order can be different, and it can indicate certain things based on those differences. But does it Does it limit whether a noun, when it's used as a predicate, indicates that the subject is an identifiable instance of that noun or one of the instances of that noun? And either way, therefore, having the qualities and nature of the noun as a predicate description? I think so. So, they say in the case of John 1:1, I'm writing, but I'm talking about them. In the case of Trinitarians, in the case of the syntax of John 1:1c, this involves a form of the Greek verb to be, was. And then you have the predicate noun theos, right, preceding the verb. And so the Trinitarians are claiming that this now, according, since Harner, and at other times too, with translations like divine, right? But as you saw, and as we showed with Caldwell himself in promoting a definite view, God, capital G-O-D, he contrasted that specifically with divine. Even though, again, as I'm going to argue, he understands ultimately God, capital G-O-D, to mean divine, right? In the sense that it would be consistent with the Trinity. And whereas God, capital G, as a definite translation, would not. And that's why they're moving away from Caldwell, even though he understands it basically the same way. Just grammatically different. And then I go on to explain, as I wrote in chapter 2, I talked more about these issues. For Trinitarians, what it means to be theos has to do with understanding the use of theos for any person of the Trinity to involve each one sharing fully. Remember, Harner, right here. Anarthrous predicate nouns preceding the verb may function primarily to express the nature or character of the subject, right? So that's what I'm talking about. For Trinitarians, what it means to be theos has to do with understanding the use of theos for any person of the Trinity, to involve each one sharing fully and equally in the nature of the Trinity. They're one God. No one person of the Trinity is this one God. And yet we have throughout the Bible instances where the Father and to some extent the sons, referred to as God or as a God, and gods, of course. Psalm 82, John 10. The Father alone is described as the one God. Ultimately, what this means is that whether a Trinitarian tries to use Caldwell's rule to argue that theos in John 1:1c is definite, or use Harner's study to argue that theos really only expresses the nature or character of the subject, no matter what, like I've been talking about, and like I wrote about a while ago. This is my third edition. This is my earlier editions as well. No matter what grammatical label a Trinitarian gives to theos in John 1:1c, or to theos anywhere else, it cannot identify Jesus definitively as the Trinity or as the Father, as a person of the Trinity, John 1:1b, however a Trinitarian sees that, but only as a divine person of the Trinity, or person of the Trinity, of course, divine person. In other words, Trinitarianism is assumed by Trinitarians in their interpretation of John 1:1, no matter what kind of noun theos is in John 1:1c, or even in 1:1b, or anywhere else in the NT, when theos is used of Jesus or of the Father. And I talk about more on those pages. But this is what I've been talking about, right? I wrote about this a while ago, and I've been consistently explaining it ever since. Even though Harner is arguing for a Trinitarian understanding of John 1:1, Jehovah's Witnesses and CWJs have cited Harner's article several times in various publications. We haven't necessarily cited it. Well, I've cited it, of course, and I'm doing it right here, and I'm CWJ. But also JW, so I represent them both, I guess, in that sense, right? But not with the Watchtower, so I won't speak for them. But I will defend where necessary. Jehovah's Witnesses have cited Harner's article several times in various publications when defending the NWT and its rendering a God, for example. And then they cite Harner here, quote from the NWT. What, though, does Harner mean by qualitative? In the quotation made here in the 1984 reference edition of the NWT. Because Harner, in that quotation, states from his article, there's no basis for regarding the predicate theos in John 1:1c as definite, contrary to Caldwell. He says, in John 1:1, I think that the qualitative force of the predicate theos is so prominent that the noun can't be regarded as definite. He doesn't say it can't be regarded as indefinite, though, right? But he doesn't say it can be, right? See how they act? They can't have it as indefinite, so they don't even bring that up. And they can't have it as definite. And that's, they're trying to deal with Caldwell, so that's specifically what they're targeting. But they leave it in this qualitative zone, right? Which is what he was talking about earlier, to express the nature or character of the subject. Because they're assuming the Trinity. Right? They're not looking at it the way the Bible uses gods, like Jesus in John 10. God calls the other sons of God gods. He uses that in his defense when they're accusing him of claiming to be theos. Same thing as we're reading about in John 1:1c, right, without the article. So, our understanding is entirely consistent, and even with Jesus' own defense. They don't believe that, though. They don't believe Jesus is one of the sons of God who was with God in the beginning. Not as a God. Not like, separate from the Father in a non-Trinitarian sense. That's why they're talking about the nature. That's why they're getting away from this definite. But even if they understand it as definite, right? If they are a Trinitarian, ultimately, they understand John 1:1c, the word was God, capital G-O-D, as him having the nature of God, being fully God. They don't understand that to mean definite in the sense that he's identified as God, even though they've taught that for a long time in many ways. All right, so what, though, does Harner mean by qualitative? Well, before I answer that question, I explain what Harner means by and why he objects to viewing theos as a definite noun. And I state here in what follows, I underline two extremely important comments Harner makes in connection with his understanding of the grammar of John 1:1c. So I want you to pay attention, okay? I know we've been going for a little while, but we won't be going for that much longer. And this is important stuff. We all knew we had to take a little time to get into these issues. I believe my writings provide the best map to use, at least to go over the stuff I've already talked about. And I'm going to get into a few other things in just a moment related to this. All right, so let's look at this quote that I give from Harner's article and the parts I highlighted and see what it has to say. Commentators on the fourth gospel. This is Harner, Trinitarian, arguing against the definite translation of God in John 1:1c, but nonetheless believing in the Trinity and in a qualitative view of theos in John 1:1c. This is what Harner says. Commentators on the fourth gospel, as far as I know, have not specifically approached the meaning of this clause from the standpoint of the qualitative force of theos, as an anarthrous predicate preceding the verb. In many cases, their interpretations agree with the explanation that is given above. But consideration of the qualitative meaning of theos would lend further clarification and support. You see, he knows. He knows, just like Bowman knows, just like they all know, that while they're not quite all getting it right on the grammatical side, it doesn't matter. On the theological side, it never changes for them. No matter whether it's John 1:1, Titus 2:13, John 20:20, it doesn't matter. We'll get to them all, and I've already talked about them all. But I'm referencing texts we haven't got to specifically in videos, so we'll get to them. But they're all the same in the Trinitarian understanding. Contextually different, grammatically different. The understanding's the same. None of the persons are ever being identified as God entirely, apart from the others. And they're never being identified as an indefinite God. They're always being identified fully as God, having the nature of God, no matter what. Right? So the grammar is really ignored in every case, and the Trinitarian is what takes precedence. They'll use the grammar as a shield. It doesn't really do much, though, unless it just keeps you at bay and you don't really see what they're doing with it. But that's why we're having this discussion. So Harner's he's trying to bring clarity to the Trinitarian presentation of this text. So he says, for example, J.H. Bernard points out that Codex L reads hotheos instead of theos. It's like a 9th century Greek text that uses hotheos in John 1:1c versus theos like all the early texts, P66, P75. But this, he continues, would contradict the preceding clause. That's why they don't really promote the Codex L reading of of ho-theos. In a similar way, W.H. Howard writes that theos and hologos are not interchangeable. Otherwise, he continues, the writer could not say the Word was with God, just like we've been talking about. Both writers, in effect, are arguing that the predicate theos cannot be regarded as definite in this clause, 1.1c. In terms of our analysis above, this would mean that clause B should not be assimilated to clause A. And then I go on to write. What Harner means when he says clause B should not be assimilated to clause A is that we should not understand John's use of theos in reference to the word as interchangeable with that of ton theon or ho-theos in the nominative in John 1.1b, the God with whom the word existed. See, they don't believe they're interchangeable, no matter what understanding. It's just that the definite understanding of God as capital G-O-D in John 1.1c is a problem for them. Because that could mean that it's interchangeable with the definite theos in John 1.1b. So they see the problem, but the Trinity is what keeps them from solving it. Well, in one sense, it solves it for them, but not in a biblical sense, right? It's the opposite of what Bowman writes about. He writes that a God is possible only in a pagan context, and that's actually the biblical understanding. John 10, Psalm 82, all the texts. Whereas the Trinitarian understanding has nothing to do with the Bible in its developed metaphysicality, right? The way they understand this nature of God in three persons and all that stuff, that's not in the Bible. They bring it to the Bible and use it to interpret the Bible like you see right now. Right? So they can't have that identification. That's why the whole God translation is a problem for them. It's making Trinitarians think they're interchangeable. And it's confusing their understanding of the Trinity for many of them. It causes a problem. So even Trinitarian scholars realize that Trinitarians are having a problem with God. Now, because they know Trinitarians, just like with Caldwell, okay, think Caldwell. Even though Caldwell was arguing for a definite translation, right, God, capital G-O-D, he still believed in the Trinity, right? He didn't really believe that the Son was the Father or that the Son was the Trinity. He just didn't understand what the implications were of his argument or of his view, right? So it's the same with other Trinitarians. Other Trinitarians who aren't like the Trinitarians that are more aware of the qualitative necessity of theos in the sense that they don't have to have a definite or indefinite application that will contradict the Trinity. Most Trinitarians, it doesn't matter, right? You'll still see Trinitarians today. Even in, I believe, Martin's editions of the Kingdom of the Cults, right? So they're reading the things we read earlier that show a misrepresentation, a failure to understand, and a misquotation, really, right? Never versus usually, Martin on Caldwell. They're still reading that stuff. So you still get Trinitarians today who quote Caldwell, who believe it's definite, right? It's just so much embedded in their thinking that even though many Trinitarians are trying to kind of help explain it better, they're still seeing it as a definite translation, and some think of it definitely. But ultimately, even with their understanding of John 1.1c as God in a definite sense, they still break it down fundamentally in a Trinitarian way. It breaks from that definite identification that they believe is correct because just not understanding it correctly, the grammar of the text, and how to classify it right, even according to how they understand it. They still devolve into the nature of God understanding. So most Trinitarians, I believe, the scholars, they're not as worried. Probably be more of a problem for them if they changed capital G-O-D at this point, right? So in one sense, they might just keep reinforcing that translation and then the understanding that it still means he's fully God. Right? Because there's other texts, like I said, Titus 2:13, where Jesus in their view is called God. And so they're not going to be able to get out of this entirely. Their only real hope is just to not have people understand what they're doing and to keep accepting the Trinity that they assume is part of their beliefs. And so when they get to Titus 2:13 or a translation of John 1:1 that has God, capital G-O-D, they're going to still read it as a Trinitarian, right? They're not going to see a problem with it being a definite capital G-O-D the great God or God, capital G-O-D. Not usually. It's still going to be devolved into the metaphysicality of the Trinity. So it's really just a translation problem for them, or an appearance problem. It's a big problem if it's broken down like we are, and we call them on it, and we say, wait a minute. No. You're arguing for this. For example, Titus 2:13 has the article. John 1:1c, he's with the God, the definite God, the known God from Genesis 1. He can't be that God. He has to be a different God than the God in John 1:1b, therefore a God. Titus 2:13, there's not another God mentioned right there with him, but he's definitely called God if you believe it. Sharp's rule applies there. And so you have the same problem you have in John 1:1. Right? If he's definitely identified as God, it's an identification of that individual, Jesus, as God, not as one with the nature of God, right? We're assuming the Trinity there. So he can't be the same God as any other God if he's the great God of Titus 2:13. He's called the God there, or the God, identifying him definitively as a God or the God of Titus 2:13. And that's why it goes on in John 1:18 to describe the Word as an only begotten God, or the uniquely begotten God. Something that the Father is not described as, but again identified as God, the only begotten God, the monogenes theos God. We'll talk about that text more later in this series. Let's finish up, though, this part here in my writing. So again, they see that as a contradiction. They can't have the clauses be identifying each other. Notice, however, that Harner points out that even those who have not argued for a qualitative sense for theos in John 1:1c have given the same explanation Harner gives, regardless of their grammatical understanding of theos in 1:1c. This explanation is none other than the Trinitarianism expressed by Bruce Vaughan and quoted with approval by Harner, namely, the Word is divine, but he is not all of divinity, for he has already been distinguished from what? What does Harner say in quoting Bruce Vaughan? Distinguished from what? The Word is divine, right? Theos without the article. They see it as qualitative, but not all of divinity, for he has already been distinguished from what or whom? Another divine person. Trinity. They just took not only theos for the Word as divine in a Trinitarian sense, right? Because another person. This is the first one. The second one is the one he's already been distinguished from. John 1:1b. I told you, didn't I, that it doesn't matter whether the article is used, whether it's John 1:1b, whether it's Titus 2:13, whether it's an anarthrous predicate nominative preceding the verb like John 1:1c. Look, right here you have Harner quoting with approval another Trinitarian, Vaughan, interpreting John 1:1c as the Word is divine in a Trinitarian sense, as we can prove by another person right there. But 1:1b, ha theos in the nominative, ton theon in the accusative, they do the same thing. Right there and everywhere. But, I mean, this is it, right? Black and white. Right there, they've taken 1:1b, which isn't an anarthrous predicate noun. It's an articulated noun that is the object of the preposition pros, right? Word was with the God. They don't care. That might as well have been an anarthrous predicate nominative in John 1:1b, right? For that, it doesn't make any difference. It's another divine person. Do you see what they're doing? They're doing it everywhere. Every time the word God is used, even in the Old Testament. Sometimes they might see it as the Trinity, but it's all assumption. It's all their beliefs read back into the text. Right here, look at it. Harner, quoting Vaughter, in explaining why they have to see Theos in John 1:1c as qualitative, contra Caldwell, is because they can't have Theos in John 1:1c be all of divinity. What's all of divinity? According to them, the person, the divine person, the word has been distinguished from in John 1:1b. Setting aside, all of divinity, right? Whether or not they mean in John 1:1b that that's the Trinity or the divine nature or the Father. Right here, it says another divine person, so it has to mean the Father there. The Word is divine, but not all of divinity because he's already been distinguished from another divine person. They see John 1:1b, hotheos ton theon, as divine person. That the Word cannot be. And that if it's a definite translation like God, in the beginning was the Word was with God, capital G-O-D, and the Word was God, capital G-O-D, they see that as leading to this contradiction or identification of the two persons, Father and Son, of the Trinity. But it's not. It's the Father as the God that everyone knows from Genesis 1, with the Word as a God, as one of the sons of God that Jesus refers to from Psalm 82 in his defense in John 10. They're assuming the Trinity for every use of God. John 1:1b, John 1:1c, you name it. Like I said, Titus 2:13, John 20:28. They cannot have the Word or Jesus or the Father as anything other than a divine person of the assumed Trinity. So it does not matter. They'll argue for it and they'll try to convince you that the grammar makes it more likely that what they're saying is correct, but they're assuming the Trinity no matter what. And their grammatical arguments are not correct. Here the word is assumed to be theos only as a divine person. We just read it. It's right there. Emphasized. You can read it on your own. They do it all the time. What Harner has tried to do and what many Trinitarians since him have done where it concerns John 1:1c is to line up their theological assumptions with their grammatical understanding of the text. Harner refers to R.E. Brown, another Trinitarian scholar, who regards the translation, the word was God, as correct for a Christian reader whose Trinitarian background has accustomed him to thinking of God as a larger concept than God the Father. See, they have a larger concept than God, the one God being the Father. We don't. Our concept of the one God is the Father. That's what the text says in plain language. 1 Corinthians 8:6. So when we see him with the God of Genesis 1, yeah, we believe that's the Father, the one God. We don't have this larger concept, this Trinitarian background that R.E. Brown is saying you need to have. Of course you do. Without a Trinitarian assumption informing you before you get to the text, you won't know what's going on. Right? So there we have it. A Trinitarian background is necessary in order to avoid misunderstanding the translation the word was God. Or even divine. But more so God, right? Because that could lead to the problem with Trinitarians identifying the God of 1:1c or the person of 1:1c as the person of 1:1b. We just read it in Harner quoting Vaughter. So Trinitarians' greater problem has to do with their acceptance of hotheos in 1:1b as definite. The reason this is a problem is because any definite use of theos in the Bible would have to refer to the Trinity, not the Father. Right? Because there's only one God to the Trinitarians, the Trinity. As a person of the theos, for there's only one theos in Trinitarianism, the Trinity. Yet, according to Bowman, for JWs to translate God is in one sense grammatically possible, but only if we adopt a pagan interpretation of John 1:1, which we know it's just the opposite, right? That's what they're doing. Non-biblical in any case. And whereas ours is directly rooted in the Bible, the very position and argument that Jesus himself uses in John 10. All right, so then I go down on page 327. I have another section more on qualitative. I really get into this, so if you want more information, I have it all. I talk about Murray J. Harris's Jesus as God, New Testament use of theos in reference to Jesus, all of it. Because they're all doing the same things. Assuming Trinitarianism, but using terms that don't make that plain. All right, so now in this section where I kind of go further with it, I talk about a few additional things. I get into the writings of others like Dan Wallace. And then I talk about a few other writings like Don Hartley. And I get into various discussions of unauthorized predicate nouns in other texts, like in John 1:1c, to show that their understanding of this grammar is not correct, even if we go along with them, right? That there's somehow this significance of the grammar of John 1:1c in contrast to John 1:1b, right? There's really no difference in terms of the ultimate understanding they attribute to the terms. But if we go along with it, I say consider the noun hamartalos, a sinner, in Luke 7:39. Here a Pharisee observes the treatment given to Jesus by a woman whom the Pharisee considers a sinner. Excuse me. The Greek is hamartalos estin. So you have the predicate nominative, hamartalos, a sinner, preceding the verb estin, which is the same verb, related to the same verb as ein was in John 1:1c. The syntax is the same as that for theos in John 1:1c, and an unauthorized predicate noun preceding the form of the verb. Don Hartley, in his study, believes this is an example that is clearly qualitative. He writes that this last example, hamartalos, I believe that's what we're going to be talking about, and not definite, is brought out further by the preceding clause. Yeah, we're talking about the same text. Luke 7:39, hamartalos estin. That this last example is qualitative and not indefinite is brought out further by the preceding clause. See, he's trying to exclude indefiniteness here, even though hamartalos is applied specifically to an individual. Just like you have the predicate noun applied to an individual in John 1:1c. So they can't have it. They really, the indefiniteness would put them in our category, right? Then they'd have to argue the way we do. But they don't, right? So he's saying it's not indefinite, right? It's clearly not definite in the sense that she's the sinner, a well-known sinner, right? Because there's not some well-known sinner that's at issue here. He's considering what kind of person she is. He says, so if he were a prophet, he's talking about the preceding clause as justifying his purely qualitative, not indefinite understanding of hamartalos. If he were a prophet, i.e. exercising prophetic abilities, he would have known what kind of woman this was who touched him, that she is sinful. The kind of woman she was is answered by the predicate construction. She was sinful. But as I've said already, if it's a predicate noun, it already is telling you what kind of woman she is. You don't have to exclude the indefiniteness of the noun applied to a singular subject. It's already there. It's a predicate noun describing the woman as a sinner and hence obviously also sinful. You can't be a sinner and not be sinful. You can't be sinful and not a sinner. So even Hartley's attempt, weak attempt, to ignore the indefinite understanding of hamartalos as applied to the woman in this example, even his resulting qualitative only understanding does not eliminate the fact that she has to be, if she has the qualities of a hamartalos. And it's the same with John 1:1c. If the word is divine, it's a God. There's no way out of that, Trinitarians. Your only way out is to assume Trinitarianism because you're afraid of the text. You don't want to embrace its teaching. That's not our problem. We accept its teaching. Okay, you deny it, and you try to force us into this later theology, this confused grammar that you guys can't even get right. And you're acting like it makes a big difference anyway, and it doesn't. It doesn't make a difference if we give you your qualitative view like I just did to point out that even if it's sinful, she's a sinner. And it doesn't make any difference whether or not you're talking about a text that isn't necessarily a qualitative use of a predicate nominative in your view, right? It could be a definite noun like theos in 1.1b. We just read Harner and Vauder referring to John 1.1b as qualitative, as a divine person, right? They're just not talking about, it's not calling him the divine person, and it's not even calling him a divine person in 1.1b, like you need it to be. You need there to be more than one divine person. It doesn't say that in John 1.1b, the God. So it would have to be the divine person, even if you assume the Trinity. And so the Trinity really is a problem in every way, and it's causing them to really have ongoing issues because they can't get out. If they try to retreat into a qualitative only position, they still can't disassociate the indefinite application to the singular subject. The predicate nominative applies to a singular subject. It's an indefinite understanding, regardless of the qualitative force. That's what a predicate does. It describes something. The noun has qualities. That doesn't give you the authority grammatically to divorce the qualities from the definite or indefinite application of the noun. That's what they're doing. Right? Whether it's definite or indefinite, like we just showed. It could be 1.1b. It could be 1.1c. It could be before the verb. It could be after the verb. It could be with the article. It's divine person, no matter what for these people. So they're not going to allow the text to stand the way it's written. They can't. We can. We do. We don't need this stuff. We don't need people trying to tell us that a singular noun, harmatalos, can't be translated and doesn't mean a sinner when it's applied to a single woman or person. And that somehow we need to say it's sinful in order to achieve the qualitative force that's already a part of the predicate application. So they're just lies, gaslighting. It's making up something that's not true and claiming that what is true proves it, right? She's sinful. We know that. She's a sinner. You haven't shown us anything. You're just claiming something in a way that allows you to say something similar to how you want us to understand the Trinity, right? You want us to understand, and even you're not consistent there, right? Because she's still a woman. She's not a person in the sense that you understand person in relation to the Trinity. So the qualitativeness that you're trying to highlight here, Hartley, or anybody, is inconsistent with the way you're using it in John 1.1 and assuming the Trinity, right? You're not just dealing with other people in a way that you see as parallel, right? You're just trying to point out a qualitative only aspect to the use of a noun in this position that you think helps your argument in John 1.1c a little bit, and it doesn't. Doesn't matter, doesn't help, doesn't change anything. It's all confusion because you guys have failed in your duty to teach these texts and the simple teaching they present to us. You have confused yourselves. You have confused the world for thousands of years, a couple almost. And we're tired of it. Okay? We're done with you. We're no longer following your false teachings on the grammar and understanding of this text. We've read it all, we've reviewed it all, and we have refuted it all, publicly, in writing, and everywhere else. You have nothing left. The Trinity is not a biblical teaching. It's in conflict with the Bible. You want to teach the Bible, stop teaching the Trinity. You want to believe the Trinity because you can't understand the Bible without it? Fine. We'll try to accommodate and help you. But if you interfere with our ministry, we're not going to tolerate it. We're not going to promote a non-biblical theology with this much confusion by people who can't apply things correctly, right? Who try to create these categories of understanding that aren't even consistent with their understanding or with how you can show the understanding would have to devolve ultimately to what contradicts their understanding. If she's sinful, she's a sinner. If the word's divine, the word's a God. It's that simple. And nothing they have presented, not Harner, not Caldwell, not Hartley, not Dixon, not Wallace, none of them have changed anything in regards to this. That's why I'm reading it. They don't have anything left. They're done. It's over for them. And so we're going over it with you and them so that you can hopefully show as many people as possible. You don't need to listen to them. They don't even understand what they're talking about sometimes. And what they do understand, they talk about wrong most of the time. Okay? They're teaching you the Trinity, later stuff. They're misusing the text. They're substituting stuff. Right? They're telling you this grammatical view and understanding that's not true. It's not consistent. It's not correct. And to show it further, as I go on to highlight here, I talk about how in this instance, harmatolos, I say if in this instance harmatolos is not definite, since there's nothing to suggest nor does Hartley argue for understanding harmatolos as definite, then what Hartley appears to be doing is trying to create at least a further grammatical understanding of a Greek noun in a certain case, in a certain grammatical position, that will allow him and other Trinitarians to then apply theos to the word without contradicting Trinitarianism. But if sinful is the meaning of the predicate nominative harmatolos in Luke 7:39, it is applied, as I just said, to an individual who must therefore be a sinner. If the subject has the qualities of a sinner, that subject is a sinner. If the word has the qualities or nature of a God, or the word is divine, he's a God. Especially if you're saying that right after identifying the God he's with, that he cannot be even according to the Trinity. They just substitute the God he's with for the person he's with. We read it. Same is true for pneuma, spirit, when applied to an individual in John 3:6. Right? God, if you say God is spirit, well, there are other spirits. The angels, Hebrews 1. Jesus is raised life-giving spirit. God is elsewhere referred to individually, identifiably, apart from other spirits. So it's the same thing. It's the same thing as harmatolos. If she's sinful, she's a sinner. If God is spirit, he's a spirit. And it doesn't, just because you can say that correctly, right? It's correct that the woman in Luke 7:39 is sinful. So it sounds okay. But it actually uses a noun, sinner, not an adjective. Right? And we can highlight the qualities because there are qualities in a noun. It's a predicate noun. It's the whole point. It's describing a subject and attributing the qualities of that noun to it, no matter where it occurs in relation to the verb. There is some significance about word order, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I'm pointing out, though, it doesn't make a difference. God is spirit. He's a spirit based on everything we know about spirits and his identification and association with other spirits, that he cannot be Trinitarians. He cannot be the seraphs that are flying above his head in Isaiah 6. He can't be the cherubim that are below him in Ezekiel. He can't be the Son who is at his right hand. You understand? We're in the text. He's a spirit. And of course he has the nature of a spirit. You want him to be spirit, right? So you can then say he's divine, right? So then you can then say there's this quality, this character, this nature, but not definite or indefinite. Divine. Wrong. Even if we allow divine for whatever reason, right? There's no reason to. It's a noun like hermatolos, theos. Not thios, theos. It doesn't change it. If the word has the nature that is divine, he's a God. Same with the woman. Same with God, who's a spirit. It doesn't change any of that. They've been lying to you, gaslighting everybody, trying to cover for their confusion over how to grammatically classify theos in John 1:1c while they slide in their Trinitarian assumptions there and in 1:1b and everywhere else. And none of it's true, right? So in spite of this, for Trinitarians, the word must share the nature of theos without actually being theos definitely or indefinitely. Yet the Bible itself allows for theos to be used with the word in one of several ways, as I have explained previously in this writing and elsewhere and in my videos. Now, let's talk just a little bit more before we close the show on this word order, right? So on this page here, in dealing with Hartley like I did here in Luke 7:39, right? And his failure to understand the indefinite application to the woman, hamartolos, a noun, and just try to use it as an adjective-like term, sinful, right? In the same way, divine. They don't want indefiniteness associated with theos in John 1:1c. They can't have that, right? What did Bowman say? It'd be a pagan understanding. So they're never going to go that way. Doesn't matter what the grammar says. They're theologically prevented from it. So then that leaves them what? It leaves them with a definite understanding. They can't have that. Contradicts 1:1b. Even for the Trinity it does. Because they see that as the Father, right? We read it. Harner, Vater. That's what they understand it as. So they have a problem with theos being definite in 1:1c. And they can't have it be indefinite. So they've created this understanding where they can just say it's qualitative. As if that somehow makes it other than definite or indefinite. It doesn't. They're just making that up. Right? Nothing says that. Nothing requires us to view any noun used as a predicate noun or just a noun as if it's not definite or indefinite. There are certain types of nouns that don't have definiteness or indefiniteness, but not theos. Right? That's why it's applied to a singular subject. Same with hamartolos. Let me share with you a reference I give here in this discussion in note 57 here at the bottom. I talk about another text involving the Greek word Sabbath. And I refer to my discussion in 3 dissertations involving Dan Wallace's view of the text in John 5:10, where you have Sabbath used as an anarthrous predicate nominative. And I contrast that with how, again, I've been saying you can have Sabbath used in another text that's not an anarthrous predicate noun, like I referenced down here, or in the dative case, or as the object of a preposition. The qualities of the noun are conveyed in each usage. Doesn't matter. They're just claiming it matters without proving it matters, and then highlighting the qualities of the noun that everybody already knows are there. We already know that if you're a God, you're divine. We already know if you're a sinner, you're sinful. Right? There's no disputing that. They're just saying, oh, okay, we agree with you there, and then that's it. We only agree with you that it has the qualities, that the word has the qualities of that noun. Right? So see, they're just taking a part of what a noun already has and then leaving the rest because they don't like it and it disagrees with their view. They're not getting their view from the text. They're taking from the text what they need for their view and leaving the rest. And then blaming us for our view. But then I note here, I say, after I point that out, that the Greek order involving anarthrous predicate nouns like Sabbath in John 5:10 doesn't make a difference in response to Wallace, or just like we talked about in Luke 7:39 in response to Hartley, or John 1:1b, right? And versus John 1:1c in response to Vater and Harner, and how they don't really make a distinction, and yet they make a distinction. I point out here, a non-Trinitarian. I didn't get into it a lot. I'm going to get into it more right now and then close this up. But I reference it right here as a source that shows a more common understanding of Greek word order, right? A non-Trinitarian understanding. They're just inventing this qualitative understanding to try to preserve the Trinity in John 1:1. When it doesn't matter. Even if they somehow were able to establish this is true for John 1:1, they can't get around the definite uses of theos the way they apply it in Titus 2:13, or the fact that the word is distinguished from a definite use of theos, hot theos, in John 1:1b. So it's just a big distraction to try to get you to see what they want you to see in John 1:1c. Right? So if they can get you to see that that's talking about the Word as divine, then they at least feel more comfortable with the Word being a divine person with God. Because then they'll explain that that's how the Trinity works, right? That he's with the Father there, right? You believe that John 1:1b is the Father, right? Oh, yeah. Well, see, so the Word's with the Father. Trinity. That's not what we're saying. When we say the Word's with the Father in John 1:1b, we mean the one God. The very thing they don't mean. Right? Just like they said earlier, he can't be all of God. The Father is all of God. There are just others who are also God. Like him. His sons. He said that. And so did his firstborn one. Psalm 82, John 10. So we use those texts and understanding to interpret what is said. Trinitarians don't do that. They instead try to get us to focus on the grammar of this one part of John 1:1, even though it's not true the way they're presenting it to us. They're trying to get us to see a divine nature for the Word while the Word is existing with God in the beginning, so they don't have to identify or deal with an identification of the Word as the one God in the beginning. Because they can't have that as part of the Trinity, even though that doesn't talk about the Trinity. It talks about the Word as theos being with the God, the known God, and then it describes the Word as a God. And obviously has the nature of a God, divine. But that's not all it says. It calls him theos, a noun, not an adjective. And the noun has the qualities that you could convey by an adjective. That's what a noun does, right? It describes a predicate nominative, a person, place, or thing. So, I refer to this study by Richard Stewart Servin, Word Order in Ancient Greek, PhD dissertation, University of Illinois, 1990, chapters 3 and 4 for more information on word order and why this is just all an illusion. This is all just a Trinitarian gimmick to try to make people think that word order in John 1:1 teaches Trinitarianism, that it allows for them to understand the noun theos basically like an adjective, divine, having the nature of something, not as a noun indefinitely or definitely applied to the Word, as an identifiable God, either way, as the one of 1:1b or another God. They can't have that. It's Trinity, right? So they only have one God, the Trinity, and three divine persons. So they can make distinctions within the persons, but that has to be assumed, right? Because there's no persons in John 1:1 or anywhere else, not that aren't also God or the God, just like they're described. So the Trinitarians changed the whole discussion. Let me share with you what is really more commonly understood and accepted for Greek word order, right? When it comes to putting a noun in a certain position or other terms in a certain position, what we call fronting, in this case, putting it before the verb. I'm going to read just a little bit more from Servin's PhD dissertation. And he talks about both classical and New Testament Greek in this dissertation. And in chapter 3, the chapter on fronting, page 66, under 3.0, it says, fronting is a very common syntactic feature of Greek prose, and it serves to provide a wide range of pragmatic effects, very important here, such as identifying topics, providing emphasis or focus, stage setting, etc. Any constituent, whether simple or complex, may be fronted in Greek. So, he goes on to give examples and talk about its use in main clauses, subordinate clauses. But it's very well understood that Greek can front terms, like nouns, to provide emphasis or focus, identify topics, or set the stage. Right? What do we have in John 1:1, everybody? What's taking place? Right? Is John not setting the stage here? Is he not making an emphasis and contrast between the Word and the God he's with? He is. He's doing both of those. He's setting the stage, right? The Word was in the beginning. The Word was there with God. The Word was a divine being or a God. There's a contrast there between the Word as theos and God in John 1:1b. It says right here that's one of the primary uses of fronting. Fronting is a very common syntactic feature of Greek prose, and it serves to provide a wide range of pragmatic effects such as identifying topics, providing emphasis or focus, and stage setting. I'm going to argue here, well, it didn't say contrasting in there, the focus and emphasis and the stage setting makes a contrast between the God the Word is with and the Word as a God, just like is done by God in Psalm 82 that Jesus reinforces with regard to himself in John 10, that the sons of God are gods, but they're not the God they were with in the beginning. Job 38:7 says the sons of God were there shouting applause. Genesis 1 says, God said, let us make. The Word was there with that God and was a God like the sons of God. That's what this text teaches. It's not teaching the Trinity. You need to already believe the Trinity to get the Trinity out of this. That's why Brown said you needed a Trinitarian background to understand the text properly, because the text doesn't teach that. The text of John 1:1 does not teach the Trinity. John 1:1 is in direct conflict with the Trinity. It is, in fact, one of, if not the most explicit contradicting text to the Trinity there is in the New Testament. It identifies the Word separate from the God of Genesis 1 as a God, in contrast to Genesis 1:1's God as the God. The stage is set by first introducing the Word in the beginning and the God the Word is with as the God, the known, identifiable, definite God. And then in 1:1c, fronts, uses a term at the beginning to continue the setting up of the stage of events, to provide emphasis and focus on the Word and what it was, a God, with God in the beginning. There are a few other things you could be if you're with God in the beginning, right? And again, we've already made plain. It's already been made plain. The sons of God were with God in the beginning. Job 38:7. Genesis 1:26, 27, 28, right around there. Let us make. Sons of God shout in applause. The Word was with God in the beginning. Contrast between hotheos and theos. Word order used, fronting of theos to continue setting up the stage and adding emphasis and focus to what the Word was. Not hotheos. That's right, Trinitarians. He's not the God he's with. Not just the person. It doesn't say that. It says the God. He's not that God. Even you admit it, you just change what it says to something you accept. So you implicitly admit he's not that God. You just change it to divine person like we saw. And he is a God, just like the sons of God are gods, plural, that both Jesus and his Father accept as gods, plural. Psalm 82, John 10, in Jesus' case, as he defends the accusation of what it means when he is theos. Exactly what we're talking about right here in this text. This text and its use of theos for the Word and John 10's use of theos for Jesus are in direct conflict with the Trinity. We've talked about John 10 in part 2. We've talked about John 1:1 in part 12. The Bible doesn't teach the Trinity, but it teaches that the sons of God are gods in a way that is hard for some people to accept. So it's understandable why some people use the Trinity to worship the God of the Bible. I don't think that's correct. And that's why I'm doing this series of videos, to try to help people understand what the Bible teaches, what it doesn't teach, what some people says it teaches, but where they're misrepresenting it. And I'm doing my best to stay true to the text, to just tell you what it says, not to ignore certain aspects of words like nouns and pretend they're just adjectives or only describing the nature of somebody, when that's what nouns that are predicate nouns used of a subject do anyway. But they're nouns, definitely or indefinitely applied to personal singular subjects like the word or like the woman in Luke 7:39. So grammatically, contextually, and theologically, in terms of the New Testament and the Bible as a whole, John 1:1 can be properly interpreted consistently with Sons of God theology, which teaches there's one God the Father, but there are others, sons of God, who are also called and considered gods to the extent that they do or do not do God's will. And in Jesus' case, we believe that that's exactly what he came to do. But that even before he came to the earth to do God's will, he was a God with God, a spirit being with God like the other sons of God, his firstborn. Not as a person of the Trinity, but as a son of God who was with his Father, the one God of the Bible.